Act 1, The Journey to North Carolina. It began like any other summer road trip, carefree, full of promise, and charged with the kind of excitement only youth can bring. 25 friends from Florida, bound together by a love for adventure, packed up their cars, loaded their gear, and hit the road, their hearts set on a week of freedom in the wilderness. They weren't your typical tourists. They weren't looking for fancy hotels or crowded beaches. No, they wanted something more, something raw, something real. They wanted escape, an unfiltered experience where they could shed the weight of expectations and simply exist. And so, they set out, weaving their way through the heart of America, leaving behind the sticky heat of Clearwater, the honking traffic, the routine of daily life, and heading for the mountains of North Carolina, a world away from everything they knew. For 2 days, they drove, their convoy winding through endless highways, passing small towns where curious eyes watched them from gas station windows and diners along the road. They stopped only for fuel, for food, for moments of rest before piling back into their cars, their laughter and music filling the air. 7 vehicles, 6 cars and a beat-up Volkswagen van, its paint chipped, its engine coughing with age, made their way toward the unknown. It didn't matter how far they had to go. They were together, and that was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon on the second evening, they finally arrived. Yancey County. The mountains stood tall, their peaks disappearing into the sky, their slopes blanketed in deep, endless forests. The air was different here, crisp, clean, untouched by the smog and salt of Florida. And the silence was something else entirely. It wasn't empty. It was alive, filled with the whispers of rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl, the murmur of the South Toe River winding its way through the land. And then, as if by fate, they found it. Briar Bottom. A remote clearing tucked between the towering trees, hidden from the rest of the world like a secret meant just for them. The river ran right beside it, clear and cold, its waters moving lazily over smooth stones. This was it. This was paradise. They wasted no time. Tents were unpacked, gear was laid out, and soon, the campsite came to life. Fires flickered to life, casting long shadows against the trunks of ancient poplars. Someone set up a tape deck on top of the van, and suddenly, the stillness of the woods was broken by music. It drifted through the trees, carried by the wind, mingling with the crackle of flames and the sound of laughter. It was a celebration not just of being there, but of being alive. They spread out across the campsite, each falling into their own rhythm. Some sat by the fire, passing around bottles of beer and hand-rolled cigarettes, their conversations meandering from the absurd to the profound. Others wandered to the river's edge, dipping their fingers into the icy water, watching the way the light of the moon danced across the ripples. A few broke away into the woods, following trails that led nowhere, just for the thrill of the unknown. And then, of course, there was the dancing. The music pulsed, and soon, the open field became their stage. Barefoot and free, they twirled, spun, lost themselves in the rhythm of the night. It wasn't just about the music. It was about feeling something bigger than themselves, the kind of freedom that you don't find in the city, the kind that only exists in moments like this, under the stars, with nothing but the wilderness and each other. Among them was Stanley Altland, the one who had made this all possible. At 20 years old, Stan was more than just another traveler. He was a believer. A dreamer. A man who saw the world not for what it was, but for what it could be. Back home, he had recently opened Clearwater's first health food store, not just a business, but a space for change, for art, for people like him who wanted something more than the ordinary. He didn't just talk about a better world, he tried to build it, piece by piece. That night, Stan didn't drink much. A couple of beers, a few hits off a joint, but mostly, he just took it all in. The people, the laughter, the place itself. He wandered from group to group, checking in on his friends, sharing a quiet moment here, a deep conversation there. He spent time with Kim Burns, the tall, striking 18-year-old he had started seeing just weeks before. They sat together beneath a tree, talking about nothing and everything all at once, the kind of conversations that stretch long into the night but feel like they pass in an instant. As the night stretched on, the energy of the party began to settle. One by one, people peeled away, disappearing into their tents or finding a soft patch of grass to collapse on. The night cooled, and the fire burned low. Those who remained gathered in small groups, their voices softer now, their movements slower. The night had done its work. It had stripped them down, left them raw, filled them with something they couldn't quite name but knew they'd remember forever. It was a moment of peace. A moment of stillness. But it wouldn't last. Because beyond the firelight, beyond the music and the laughter, something else was moving. Something unseen. Something waiting. And before the night was over, their paradise would become a nightmare. Act 2, the night of July 3, 1972. The air had changed. It was subtle at first, like the way the wind shifts just before a storm rolls in. But no one noticed. Not yet. At Briar Bottom, the night had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The music had faded to a low hum, replaced by quiet conversations and the occasional burst of laughter. The beer had been flowing, the smoke from hand-rolled joints still lingered in the air, mixing with the woodsy scent of the campfire. Some campers had already crawled into their sleeping bags, their bodies curled up inside their tents or stretched out under the stars. Others remained awake, lost in their own little worlds, wrapped up in the magic of the moment. This, they thought, is what freedom feels like. Kevin Shea wasn't ready to sleep. Not yet. The beer had made him bold, and the thrill of being out in the wild gave him ideas. "I'm gonna find me a rattlesnake," he announced, grabbing a stick and marching toward the woods with exaggerated confidence. The others barely looked up. This was Kevin. A little reckless, a little wild, but mostly harmless. He disappeared into the darkness, his voice trailing off as he called out to creatures that had no interest in answering. "Here, Snakey, Snakey." Max Johnson and a few others laughed, shaking their heads before turning back to their own conversations. Some wandered off toward their tents, brushing the dew from their clothes as they unzipped the canvas flaps and slipped inside. The temperature was dropping, and the campfire, once a roaring blaze, was now a pile of glowing embers, sending thin trails of smoke curling into the night sky. The night felt endless. Peaceful. As if time had slowed down just for them. But then, something changed. It started with a flicker of light in the distance. Faint. Almost unnoticeable at first. Just a reflection against the river's surface, like fireflies winking in and out of the trees. But this wasn't fireflies. This wasn't something natural. The glow became brighter. Two beams of light, cutting through the darkness, moving slowly, deliberately. Engines rumbled low, deep, and steady. Trucks. Heavy trucks. They weren't speeding. They weren't reckless. They moved with purpose, their headlights off, slipping across the river as if they were trying not to be seen. Phil Loki was the first to notice. He was walking back from his car, bedroll in hand, when he spotted them. His heart kicked up a notch. Something about it didn't feel right. Trucks, this late at night? Moving that slowly? Why keep their lights off? He froze, watching as the vehicles rolled to a stop on the other side of the clearing. The engines cut off, and for a moment, everything was still. The silence was almost suffocating. Then, doors opened. Footsteps. The sound of metal clinking, something heavy being adjusted, loaded. Phil barely had time to process what was happening before figures emerged from the shadows. 7 men, moving like a trained unit. He could see their silhouettes against the faint glow of the truck's broad shoulders, purposeful strides, and something else that sent a chill up his spine. guns. The men advanced through the trees, closing in on the campsite. No words. No warnings. Just the unmistakable sound of shotguns being racked. What the hell? For a split second, Phil thought about running. He could bolt into the woods, disappear into the darkness. But his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen, trapped between instinct and the sheer disbelief of what he was seeing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. At the fire pit, David Satterwhite's dog stirred, its ears perking up at the approaching figures. A low growl rumbled in its throat. That was when everything shattered. Without warning, the armed men rushed in, emerging from the shadows like ghosts. Flashlights snapped on, beams of blinding light cutting through the darkness. Voices barked commands, boots stomped through the clearing, kicking at sleeping bags, yanking people to their feet. The quiet, peaceful night had just turned into chaos. Get up. Hands where we can see 'em. Nobody move. The campers were stunned, blinking against the harsh light, trying to make sense of what was happening. Some were too dazed to react, their bodies still sluggish from sleep or the haze of alcohol. Others stumbled to their feet, hands raised in instinctive surrender. Kim Burns let out a startled yelp as a boot nudged her side, forcing her upright. Max Johnson sat up too fast and nearly fell over. Punny Porter, the older Vietnam veteran, stayed still for a moment, assessing the situation with the kind of eerie calm that only comes from experience. And then, realization hit. These men weren't just random intruders. They weren't locals come to scare off the campers. They were law enforcement. Or at least, that's what they appeared to be. Sheriff Kermit Banks stood at the center of the chaos, his uniform barely visible in the dim light. His presence alone was enough to command attention. He wasn't some small-town officer on a routine patrol. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed he was in charge of this place, this moment. "What's the problem?" he muttered, voice low and cold. The campers were too stunned to answer. What problem? What had they done? No one knew. But it didn't matter. The law had arrived, and they weren't asking questions, they were making statements. The deputies moved fast, rounding up the campers, forcing them into a loose group near the fire pit. Pocket knives, keychains, even hairpins were confiscated. They demanded to know about drugs, about weapons. But even when they found nothing, their aggression didn't waver. "You've got no right to do this," David Satterwhite finally spoke, his voice sharp, defiant. Sheriff Banks turned to him, his gaze like steel. Then, slow and deliberate, he spoke the words that sent an icy dread through the group. "No, you don't." For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the crackling of the dying fire and the distant rush of the river. Then, without warning, everything erupted. A shout. A scuffle. A sudden burst of movement. Phil Loki barely had time to react before he felt rough hands grabbing him, twisting his arms behind his back. A set of metal cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. He tried to protest, but the barrel of a shotgun pressed into his back, silencing him. At the fire pit, Satterwhite's dog barked, sensing the tension, its growls turning into frantic yelps. The sheriff's grip on his shotgun tightened. "Put that goddamn dog up," he ordered, his voice a low growl, "or I'll shoot it myself." David hesitated, then reached for the dog's collar, leading it toward a tree. But the tension had already reached its breaking point. The sheriff's patience was gone. His anger was rising. And then, in one violent motion, he lifted his shotgun and struck. A loud crack. A grunt of pain. The butt of the gun connected with flesh. And then, the gun fired. Act 3, The Raid. There are moments in life where time seems to slow, where the air grows thick, and the weight of something terrible presses down before it even happens. For the campers at Briar Bottom, That moment arrived with the sound of crunching gravel, the low rumble of engines, and the sudden, suffocating silence that followed. No one spoke. No one moved. The world had changed in an instant, but they didn't know how. Not yet. 7 figures stepped out of the shadows, their boots landing heavy on the damp earth. They moved with precision, too controlled, too practiced, too cold. These weren't curious locals. They weren't friendly rangers stopping by to check permits. They were something else entirely. And they were carrying guns. At first, the campers didn't react. It didn't make sense. The sight of armed men moving through the darkness like a well-trained unit wasn't something their minds could immediately comprehend. This was a campsite, a peaceful retreat, a place for music and freedom and escape. But the figures moving toward them weren't here to join the party. They were here for something else. And they were moving fast. The first thing to break the silence was the snap of a shotgun being pumped. The sound cut through the air, sharp and unmistakable. Then came the flashlights, blinding, relentless, stabbing into faces, sweeping across the clearing, searching for something, for someone. Get up. The voice was a snarl, deep and commanding. Before anyone could react, the figures surged forward. Tents collapsed under the force of boots, sleeping bags were ripped open, hands grabbed at arms and shoulders, yanking people from the ground. The laughter from earlier in the night had been swallowed whole, replaced by the bark of orders, the scuffle of movement, the shocked gasps of those being dragged from their sleep. Someone screamed. A short, sharp sound cut off almost immediately. Someone else cursed, demanding to know what was happening. But there were no answers. Only force. Phil Loki barely had time to register what was happening before rough hands grabbed him. He was shoved forward, stumbling over a tree root, his heart hammering against his ribs. A flashlight beam hit his face, searing his vision with a white-hot glare. He flinched, trying to turn away, but the pressure on his back kept him locked in place. "What's going on?" he managed, his voice hoarse. No response. Just the hard edge of a shotgun pressing against his spine, forcing him toward the center of the camp where others were already being gathered. He could see them now, his friends, his people, lined up in the flickering glow of the dying fire, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. Some were still half asleep, their minds struggling to catch up with reality. Others were wide-eyed, tense, their hands clenched into fists at their sides, not out of defiance but out of pure, raw terror. "What's the trouble here?" The voice came from one of the men, a broad-shouldered figure standing just outside the fire's reach. His tone was casual, almost mocking. But the way his fingers flexed around the grip of his shotgun said otherwise. No one answered. Because no one knew. Kim Burns was shaking. She wasn't cold, the night was still warm enough to leave sweat on her skin, but her body wouldn't stop trembling. A hand had grabbed her earlier, yanking her to her feet so roughly that she had nearly fallen. Now, she stood next to Stan Altland, her breath shallow, her heart slamming against her ribs. A man in a dark jacket stepped toward her, his face unreadable in the shadows. Before she could react, his hands were on her, rough and unrelenting, patting down her pockets, searching for something. "Hey," she snapped, jerking back, but the grip on her arm tightened. "Stay still," the man growled. Kim bit her lip, her body stiff as his hands moved over her, reaching into her pockets, pulling out nothing but a crumpled tissue and a few coins. The man examined them as if they might be something more before tossing them to the ground with a grunt. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But she could do neither. Not now. Across the camp, Kevin Shea was still groggy from the beer, his mind sluggish as he tried to make sense of the chaos. He had been out in the woods earlier, joking about hunting rattlesnakes. Now, it felt like he had stumbled into a different world entirely. One of the men had found him near the edge of the clearing, grabbing his shoulder, spinning him around. Kevin had barely opened his mouth before the barrel of a shotgun was pressed against his chest. "Move," the man ordered. Kevin moved. Sheriff Kermit Banks stood near the fire, his expression unreadable. He was a thick man, broad in the shoulders, his uniform stretched tight over his chest. His presence alone was enough to command attention, but the shotgun in his hands made it clear this wasn't just a show of authority. This was something else. Something worse. His deputies moved through the camp like hunters closing in on prey. Some searched tents, kicking over belongings, flipping open bags, pulling out blankets and clothes as if expecting to find something dangerous hidden beneath them. Others focused on the people, lining them up, making them stand shoulder to shoulder in the firelight. "Do you have drugs?" one of the deputies asked, his voice sharp, almost eager. No one answered. Because the truth was, yes, some of them had pot, a few had acid, but that wasn't the point. They had been careful. They weren't causing trouble. They weren't hurting anyone. And yet, here they were treated like criminals, like something less than human. Stan Altland knew they had to stay calm. He had seen enough bad situations escalate before, and he wasn't about to let this turn into something worse. He lifted his hand slightly, his voice steady despite the fear tightening in his throat. "Look, man," he said, speaking directly to the sheriff. "We don't want trouble. We're just camping here. That's all." The sheriff's gaze flicked toward him. Something in his eyes shifted, darkened. "Is that so?" Stan nodded. "Yeah. We're just here to relax, enjoy the mountains. That's all this is." For a moment, it seemed like the sheriff might listen. But then, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't even an amused one. It was something else entirely. Something cold. Something dangerous. "That's so," the sheriff repeated, adjusting his grip on his shotgun. "Then why do I smell trouble?" Stan didn't have an answer. And he didn't get a chance to find one. Because in the next instant, everything unraveled. A sharp movement. A raised hand. A flash of light off the metal barrel of a shotgun. A blow. A shot. A scream. And just like that, paradise was gone. Act 4, the confrontation. Fear has a way of twisting time. Of stretching a single second into eternity. And in that moment, standing in the firelight of Briar Bottom, with the air thick with the scent of damp earth and burning wood, time slowed to a crawl. David Satterwhite stood firm. His shoulders squared. His fists clenched at his sides. He had spent his life in these woods. He knew the land better than anyone. He had grown up with the sound of the river in his ears, the rustling leaves as his lullaby. And now, in the place that had always felt like home, he was being told he had no rights. He looked Sheriff Kermit Banks in the eye, refusing to shrink under the weight of that statement. His voice was steady, controlled, but the fire beneath it was unmistakable. "No, you don't." The words echoed in the stillness, sinking into the bones of everyone who heard them. They weren't just words. They were a declaration. A sentence. A warning. David's dog, a shaggy, white mutt with dark eyes that gleamed in the firelight, sensed the tension. It stood beside him, its ears flat, its muscles taut, a low growl rumbling deep in its throat. Animals know. They always know. And right now, this dog knew something was very, very wrong. Sheriff Banks shifted his stance, adjusting his grip on the shotgun. He wasn't the kind of man used to being questioned, least of all by a 20-something kid with dirt on his jeans and rebellion in his eyes. He had come here to assert control, to remind these outsiders that this land wasn't theirs to take. And now he was being challenged. That wasn't going to stand. "Put the damn dog away," Banks ordered, his voice sharp as broken glass. "Or I'll shoot it myself." David hesitated. His hands twitched at his sides. He could feel every set of eyes on him, his friends, the campers, the deputies. The fire crackled between them, sending small embers drifting into the night like dying stars. "You don't have to do this," David said slowly, his voice measured, controlled. "We're not hurting anyone. We're just camping." Banks' expression didn't change. His knuckles tightened around the stock of his shotgun. "Get the dog," he repeated, low and final. David exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He turned, reaching for the dog's collar, his fingers brushing against its fur. But in that instant, something shifted. Maybe it was the way Banks leaned forward. Maybe it was the way David's hesitation looked too much like defiance. Maybe it was just the way power, once given freely, is never willingly returned. Whatever it was, it happened fast. Faster than thought. Faster than breath. A sudden movement. A sharp intake of air. And then, the butt of the shotgun swung through the firelight, an arc of dark metal against the glow. It struck with brutal force, the impact sharp, sickening, undeniable. David staggered. His head snapped to the side, pain exploding in his skull. He barely had time to register what had happened before. Bang! The shotgun went off. A deafening explosion, ripping through the silence, through the night, through the very fabric of the world. Everything stopped. For one terrible, suspended moment, no one moved. The firelight flickered over wide, horrified eyes. Shadows danced across stunned faces. The river, which had been murmuring quietly just seconds before, now seemed impossibly loud. And then, "Oh my God!" A voice, raw, broken. The first crack in the stunned silence. Stan Altland was on the ground. Blood spread beneath him, dark and glistening, pooling into the mossy earth. His chest rose in sharp, shallow gasps, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to speak, but no words came out. "Somebody help him." Kim Burns dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over the wound, useless, trembling. Stan's fingers twitched, grasping at the empty air, reaching for something unseen. But there was nothing to reach for. Nothing but darkness closing in. The sheriff's shotgun was still smoking. No one knew what to do. No one breathed. Even the deputies, who had followed Banks without question up until this moment, seemed frozen in place. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't part of the plan. Punny Porter, the Vietnam vet, moved first. He lunged forward, his hands already pressing against Stan's chest, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to do something, anything. "Stay with me, man," he whispered, his voice tight. "Just stay with me." But Stan's body was limp beneath his hands, his blood soaking into the dirt, into the earth, disappearing into the place that had once been his paradise. Sheriff Banks didn't speak. He didn't move. For a second, it almost looked like he wasn't even breathing. And then, slowly, he lowered the shotgun. Reached into his pocket. Pulled out another shell. With the same methodical calm as before, he reloaded. The sound of the shell sliding into place sent a shiver down every spine in that clearing. This wasn't over. Not yet. Step away from him. The order came sharp, direct. It took a second for Punny to realize it was meant for him. He looked up, his hands still pressed against Stan's body, his fingers slick with blood. His face twisted in disbelief. "You shot him," he said, his voice ragged, furious. "You dash. Step away." Punny's eyes flicked to the barrel of the shotgun, then back to Banks' face. The sheriff's expression was unreadable. Cold. Detached. Like this wasn't a human being bleeding out in front of him, but something less. Something insignificant. Slowly, Reluctantly, Puni leaned back, his hands lifting off Stan's chest. The moment he did, the sheriff gave a small nod to his men. "Wrap him up." The deputies hesitated, then moved. They grabbed Stan's arms, his legs, dragging him across the ground like a bag of discarded belongings. His shirt caught on a rock, tearing slightly, exposing his skin to the cold air. Kim Burns let out a strangled sob. Sue Cello stood frozen, her hands pressed over her mouth, her entire body trembling. The others, Max, Phil, Kevin, could only watch, their horror paralyzing them where they stood. Stan's body was lifted, dumped into the back of a truck. The tailgate slammed shut. Sheriff Banks dusted off his hands, turned to the campers. "Now," he said, his voice steady, unshaken. "Y'all sit down. Nobody moves. Nobody speaks. And maybe, just maybe, you'll get to leave here alive." No one argued. Because in that moment, they knew. They weren't just campers anymore. They weren't just travelers looking for freedom. They were prisoners. And their fate? That wasn't up to them anymore. Act 5, the tragedy. It happened in an instant, but the echoes of that shotgun blast would last forever. Stanley Altland had been standing just feet away when the trigger was pulled. There was no time to react, no time to move. The force of the blast hit him like a freight train. 9 pellets of double-aught buckshot tore through the air, slamming into his chest and neck. Each one the size of a .32 caliber bullet. Each one meant to kill. Stan didn't scream. He barely even made a sound. His body jerked violently, his feet lifting off the ground from the sheer impact. And then, he fell. His knees hit first, hard against the damp earth. His arms flailed slightly, instinctively reaching for something, anything, to hold onto. But there was nothing. His body crumpled, his back arching for a brief moment before he collapsed completely. The breath left his lungs in a sharp, agonizing wheeze. The music was gone. The laughter, long since silenced. Now, there was only the sound of the forest, the distant rush of the river, and the soft, wet sound of blood soaking into the ground. Kim Burns didn't think. She just moved. 1 second, she had been frozen in place, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The next, she was on the ground beside him, her hands pressing against his chest, as if that alone could stop the life from slipping away. "Oh my God. Somebody help me." Her voice cracked as she spoke, the words barely more than a whisper, but they carried through the clearing like a scream. Her hands trembled as she pressed harder against the wound, but the blood kept coming, warm and sticky, seeping through her fingers, pooling beneath them in the dirt. Stan, look at me," she pleaded, her grip tightening around his hand. His fingers twitched slightly, curling around hers for just a second before going limp. His eyes fluttered open, hazy, unfocused. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, finally, "Kim." It was barely a whisper. A breath. A plea. Then, nothing. Puni Porter had seen this before. In Vietnam, he had watched men take bullets and keep running. He had seen men lose limbs and still try to fight. He had also seen men die instantly, from a single shot to the chest. He had learned the difference between wounds that could be saved and those that couldn't. And when he saw Stan's injuries, when he saw the way his body had gone still, the way his chest barely moved, he knew. He knew, even as his hands moved on instinct, pressing a folded shirt against the wound, even as he barked orders for someone to find help, he knew it was too late. "Stay with me, man," Puni muttered, his voice low, desperate. "Just stay with me." But the response never came. The blood was everywhere now. It was on Puni's hands, on his arms. It was in the dirt, soaking into the moss, disappearing into the earth that had been so peaceful just moments before. Stan gasped, his breath rattling in his throat, his body barely holding on. And then, he stopped. His fingers twitched once. Then, nothing. The moment stretched, thick and unbearable, as the realization sank in. Stanley Altland was gone. The campers who had been watching the ones who had been frozen in place, too shocked to move, finally broke. Kim Burns let out a wail that seemed to tear from the deepest part of her soul. Her hands were still pressed against Stan's chest, as if willing him back to life, as if her touch alone could pull him from the abyss. Sucello covered her mouth, her entire body shaking. She looked like she might scream, but no sound came out. Max Johnson had gone pale, his hands clenched so tight that his knuckles had turned white. Kevin Shea, the one who had been joking about hunting rattlesnakes just an hour ago, stumbled back a step, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. Phil Loki felt like he was going to be sick. His stomach twisted painfully, and for a moment, all he could do was stare at the spreading pool of blood, dark against the earth, too much, too fast. No one moved. No one spoke. Until... Back up. The voice was sharp, commanding. Cold. Sheriff Banks. The sheriff stood over them, his shotgun still in his hands, the smoke from the blast curling lazily into the night air. His expression was unreadable, but there was no fear in his eyes. No regret. No remorse. Step away from him, he repeated. Honey didn't move. He stayed where he was, his hands still pressing against Stan's lifeless body. His breathing was heavy, his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ached. What the hell did you do? Honey growled, his voice low, trembling with barely contained rage. Banks didn't answer. Instead, he turned to his men. Get him in the truck. The deputies hesitated, glancing at each other. Some of them looked unsettled now, their hands hovering uncertainly over their weapons. They hadn't signed up for this. A drug bust? Sure. Scaring off some hippies? Fine. But shooting an unarmed man? Watching the life drain from his body right in front of them? That was something else entirely. But no one spoke up. No one argued. Because arguing with Kermit Banks meant you were next. They moved in, grabbing Stan's arms, his legs. His body was limp in their hands, his head rolling slightly as they lifted him off the ground. The blood left behind was still warm, still wet. Kim let out another choked sob as she reached for him, but a deputy stepped in front of her, blocking her path. No, he said flatly. Stay back. You can't just dash, she started, but the words got caught in her throat. Because she knew. She knew that fighting back wouldn't do anything. It wouldn't bring Stan back. It would only get her hurt, too. So she stayed where she was, her hands shaking, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She watched as they carried him away, as they loaded him into the back of the truck like he was nothing. Like he was just another piece of gear. Another object to be disposed of. The tailgate slammed shut. The sound rang through the clearing like a gunshot. For a long time, no one moved. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, the distant rush of the river, and the soft, uneven breaths of those who had been left behind. Then, Sheriff Banks turned back to them. Sit down. No one moved. I said, sit down. His voice was sharp now, his patience worn thin. Slowly, reluctantly, the campers lowered themselves to the ground, their bodies stiff, their minds still trying to catch up with the horror of what had just happened. Nobody moves. Nobody speaks, Banks continued, his tone eerily calm now. You all just sit right there, and maybe you'll get to go home. And then, just like that, it was over. Act 5, The Tragedy. There are moments in life when reality fractures, when time slows, when the world narrows to a single point of focus. And in that moment, the only thing that existed was the sound of the shotgun blast. A deafening roar tore through the stillness of the forest, drowning out every other sound: the crackle of the fire, the murmuring of the river, the breath caught in the lungs of every person in that clearing. Stanley Altland stood just feet away when it happened. There was no warning. No chance to react. No time to move. 9 heavy pellets of double-aught buckshot ripped through the air, slamming into his chest and neck. Each one the size of a small bullet. Each one meant to destroy. And they did. Stan's body jerked violently, his feet lifting off the ground from the sheer force of impact. For a split second, he seemed to hang there, frozen in time, as if the universe itself refused to acknowledge what had just happened. And then, he fell. The breath left his lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp. His knees buckled. His arms flailed slightly, his fingers clawing at the empty air as if reaching for something, anything to hold onto. But there was nothing. His body hit the earth with a dull thud. His back arched for a brief moment before he collapsed completely, his limbs sprawled unnaturally against the dirt, against the blood now pooling beneath him. For one terrible second, there was silence. And then, the screaming began. "Oh my God! Somebody help me!" Kim Burns was the first to move. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his chest, over the spreading stain of red soaking through his shirt. Her breath hitched in her throat, her eyes wild, disbelieving. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. "Stan, look at me," she begged, gripping his hand, squeezing his fingers between hers. "Stay with me." His lips parted slightly. His eyes flickered, unfocused. He tried to say something, but the words never fully formed. Only a faint whisper escaped, barely more than a breath. "Kim." Her grip tightened. "I'm here. I'm right here." But the light in his eyes was already fading. Punny Porter had seen this before. In Vietnam, he had watched men go down just like this. He had seen the way the body responded to fatal wounds, the way the muscles twitched involuntarily, the way the eyes fought to stay open just a moment longer before the inevitable took over. He had seen death before. And now, as he knelt beside Stan, pressing his hands against the wound, trying, knowing it was pointless, but trying anyway, he knew he was seeing it again. "Stay with me, man," he muttered, his voice low, desperate. His hands were steady, trained, instinctual. But it didn't matter. The damage was too severe. There was too much blood. Too much missing. He could feel it. The life slipping away. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. The others could only watch, paralyzed by shock, by fear, by the sheer brutality of what had just unfolded before them. Sucello covered her mouth with both hands, her entire body trembling. Tears streamed down her face, but no sound came from her lips. She looked like she wanted to scream but couldn't force the air from her lungs. Max Johnson stood frozen, his fists clenched so tight his nails dug into his palms. His breathing was shallow, rapid. He kept shaking his head, like he could undo what had just happened if he just denied it hard enough. Kevin Shea, who had been laughing, drinking, joking about hunting rattlesnakes just an hour ago, took an unsteady step back. His stomach twisted violently. He swallowed hard, but it didn't help. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Phil Loki felt sick. His stomach churned, acid burning the back of his throat. The world tilted beneath him, too fast, too surreal. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. And then there was Sheriff Kermit Banks. He stood over them, his shotgun still raised, the barrel still warm from the blast. Smoke curled lazily from the muzzle, twisting in the night air. His face was unreadable, cold, detached. There was no regret in his eyes. No shock. No hesitation. "Step away from him," Banks ordered, his voice low, firm. Puni didn't move. He stayed where he was, his hands still pressing against Stan's chest, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "What the hell did you do?" he growled, his voice shaking with fury. Banks didn't answer. He didn't have to. Instead, he turned to his men. "Get him in the truck." For a second, no one moved. Even the deputies hesitated. Some of them looked uncertain now, their hands twitching at their sides, their gazes flicking between each other. This wasn't what they had signed up for. A raid? Sure. A show of force? Maybe. But this? This was something else. But no one spoke up. No one challenged Banks. Because challenging him meant you were next. The deputies moved in, grabbing Stan's arms, his legs. His body was limp in their hands, his head rolling slightly as they lifted him off the ground. Blood dripped from his shirt, leaving dark stains against the dirt, against the moss, against the place that had once been his paradise. Kim let out a strangled sob, reaching for him, but a deputy shoved her back roughly. "No," the deputy snapped. "Stay put. You can't do this," she cried, her voice raw, breaking. "You dash." "Shut up," another deputy muttered. "Just shut up." The tailgate of the truck slammed open. The sound echoed through the clearing like a second gunshot. And then, without ceremony, without pause, they tossed him inside. The tailgate slammed shut. And just like that, he was gone. The weight of what had just happened settled over the campers like a suffocating blanket. They had come here searching for peace, for freedom, for escape. And now, all they had was blood and silence. No one spoke. No one moved. The fire crackled softly, oblivious to the horror that had just unfolded beside it. Sheriff Banks turned back to the remaining campers. His expression was calm, unreadable. "Sit down," he ordered. No one moved. "I said, sit down." His voice was sharper now, the patience long gone. Slowly, reluctantly, the campers lowered themselves to the ground, their bodies stiff, their breaths uneven. "Nobody moves? Nobody speaks," Banks continued, his tone eerily casual now. "You all just sit right there, and maybe just maybe you'll get to leave here alive." And then, as if nothing had happened, he turned away. Act 6, Aftermath. For a long time, no one moved. The air was thick, suffocating. The scent of gunpowder still lingered, mixing with the damp earth, the smoke from the dying fire. The campers stood frozen, their bodies locked in place, their minds struggling to catch up to what had just happened. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. And yet, Stanley Altland lay motionless on the ground, his blood soaking into the dirt, his breath stolen away forever. Alive, gone in an instant. A soul, ripped from this world with the pull of a trigger. Sheriff Banks exhaled slowly, methodically. Without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a fresh shotgun shell, and slid it into the chamber with a quiet click. He wasn't rushed. He wasn't shaken. He was calm, like a man who had just completed a routine task. Like this was just another day. The sound sent a ripple through the group, but no one dared to react. No one moved. No one spoke. Because they knew. They knew that any sudden movement, any wrong word, and the next shot fired wouldn't be an accident. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Banks gave the order. "Take him." His deputies hesitated. Just for a second. It was almost imperceptible the way their hands twitched at their sides, the way their gazes flickered toward one another, searching for some kind of unspoken reassurance. But there was none to be found. Orders were orders. And so, they moved. Two men stepped forward, their boots crunching against the dirt, their hands reaching down to grab what remained of Stan Altland. His body was limp, heavy, dead weight in their arms. They didn't handle him gently. They didn't check for signs of life. They knew there was none left to find. Kim Burns let out a strangled sob, reaching for him, but a deputy stepped in her way, his hand gripping her shoulder, holding her back. "No," he said flatly. "Stay put. You can't do this," she choked out, shaking her head. "You can't just dash." "Shut up," another deputy muttered. "Just shut up." Her whole body trembled. She could feel the rage building inside her, clawing at her throat, burning behind her eyes. But what could she do? What could any of them do? Nothing. They were powerless. Completely and utterly powerless. Stan's body dragged against the ground, his arms limp, his head lolling slightly to one side. His shirt had been soaked through with blood, the fabric sticking to his chest, but it didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered anymore. The back of the truck was open, waiting. And without a word, without a single ounce of hesitation, they tossed him inside. The tailgate slammed shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the trees. That was it. No apologies. No explanations. No acknowledgement of what had just been taken from them. Just silence. Sucello's scream shattered that silence. A raw, guttural sound tore from her throat, her fists clenched, her entire body shaking with a fury she had no way to release. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. "You killed him," she screamed, her face streaked with tears, her breath coming in ragged gasps. You bastards." Her body jolted as if she might run forward, might fight, might do something. Anything. But a firm grip yanked her back, holding her in place. Max Johnson. His arms wrapped around her, his face twisted in grief, his own tears threatening to fall. "Don't," he whispered. "They'll kill you too." And she knew he was right. They had come here looking for peace, for escape. A place where they could be free. A place where they could breathe. But now, all they found was loss. Stan was gone. And with him, something else had been taken. The innocence of the night. The magic of the firelight. The unshakable belief that they were safe. They weren't. They never had been. Sheriff Banks turned back to the campers, his gaze sweeping over them, cold and unmoved. For him, this was just another day. Just another message sent. Another lesson taught. He wasn't worried about consequences. He wasn't worried about anything. "Sit down," he said, his voice low, firm. No one moved. "I said sit down." This time, his voice cracked like a whip. A few of them flinched, their bodies reacting before their minds could catch up. Slowly, one by one, they sank to the ground, their backs stiff, their eyes hollow. "Nobody moves," Banks continued, his tone eerily casual now. "Nobody speaks. And maybe just maybe you'll get to leave here alive." The truck rumbled to life. The engine roared. And then, just like that, it was gone. Taking Stan with it? Taking the night with it? Taking everything with it? Act 7, The Haunting Legacy. The night at Briar Bottom had ended, but for those who survived, the nightmare was just beginning. The Florida travelers left the campsite as the first light of dawn crept over the mountains. They didn't speak. They barely even looked at one another. Their bodies moved on instinct, packing up what little remained, stuffing sleeping bags into trunks, slamming car doors shut. Every movement was mechanical, robotic, drained of life. The same people who had danced under the stars just hours before now moved like ghosts, their spirits shattered beyond repair. No one could erase the sound of the gunshot ringing in their ears. No one could unsee the blood staining the earth where Stan had fallen. No one could undo what had been done. They had come here looking for freedom. What they found was something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The road back to Florida stretched endlessly before them, but the weight they carried was heavier than anything they had packed in their cars. It pressed against their chests, tightening with every mile. The mountains that had once felt like a sanctuary now loomed behind them like silent witnesses to the horror they had endured. And the river, still flowing, still unchanged, whispered its cold indifference. Nature had moved on. But they never would. Stanley Altland had been 20 years old. A dreamer. A believer. A man who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. He had wanted something different. Something better. And in one brutal, senseless moment, it was all taken away. His friends would never forget the way he had looked that night, how he had stood tall, unafraid, trying to keep the peace even when the world around him crumbled. How he had smiled earlier that evening, his eyes bright with excitement for the trip ahead. How his blood had soaked into the dirt, dark and final. A life that had been full of promise, cut short before it had even begun. Back in Clearwater, his absence was a hollow void, an ache that never truly faded. His friends tried to make sense of it. Tried to find words for something that had no explanation. Some of them told the story, again and again, as if saying it out loud might help them understand. Others buried it deep inside, locking it away in a part of themselves they would never open again. But no matter how they coped, they all carried the same unshakable truth. Stan was gone. And no one was ever going to answer for it. Sheriff Kermit Banks never faced justice. There was no trial. No reckoning. No consequences. The official report was vague, full of half-truths and convenient omissions. A misunderstanding, they called it. An unfortunate incident. No criminal charges were ever filed. The message was clear: some lives mattered more than others. The Florida travelers scattered over time. Some stayed. Some left. Some tried to forget. Some never could. But no matter where they went, no matter how many years passed, they were all bound together by the night at Briar Bottom. A night that would never leave them. A scar that would never heal. 50 years later, the echoes of that night still remain. A moment in time. A wound in history. A tragedy that faded from the headlines but never from the hearts of those who lived it. And a question that will never be answered. Why?